You're listening to Remotely One, a podcast that educates, entertains, and inspires you to take your life back from the office commute. I'm Rick, a former beer rep who left the warehouse to become a voice actor and digital creator.
And I'm Koenig, a remote work advocate and consultant. We're going to speak with some of the top professionals who have managed to avoid the commute as they share stories from the most inspiring to the most comical, all while working remotely.
Man, this sounds awesome. Let's clock in.
I went to school for theater, have a Bachelor of Fine Arts, and it was even like weird theater too. Like I was in the experimental theater wing at New York University, so we did all kinds of fun, strange stuff.
But what do you mean strange stuff, though?
So I did like there's a lot of like rolling around on the floor in sweatpants. There was we did a class. It was actually an awesome class in the Suzuki method of actor training. It's this crazy Japanese guy, Tadashi Suzuki, and he's got like a theater company in Saratoga Springs, New York, and you do all this like insane physical conditioning.
So, but like I don't understand. You just roll. Like I have this visual of just a bunch of adults rolling around the floor in sweatpants.
There's like some more method to it than that, but like some of the stuff, that's about how it feels, and it actually works. The studio that's been going for like 35 years because they produce really interesting outcomes.
That's some Tom Cruise stuff right there.
You said that this style was created in the 60s and 70s, and all I could think about were a bunch of people on mushrooms in peyote just being like, oh, and like...
Yeah, I mean, so it's not that. But, it's that with like decades of refinement.
Welcome back to Remotely One. I'm your guest co-host, Hampton Clarkson, joined by my esteemed brother, Hampton Clarkson. Since you know how to find us now, do us a huge favor and go to ratethispodcast.com/remotely1 and leave us a review. Again, ratethispodcast.com/remotely1. If you could do that for us, we'd be ever so thankful. So since 2015, Remotely One is one of the largest communities of remote work professionals with over 2,800 Slack members and 4,000 email subscribers. It's free to join, so go check it out on remotely1.com. And with that out of the way, Colleen, give us a tease or two about today's guest.
Ooh, so thank you, sir. Thanks for being a guest co-host on the podcast. It's my big little brother, and he's back showing the guns again. Damn it! Put those things away. Put those things away. Damn, man. Damn, I'm feeling good. I'm jacked up. Although I've known our guests for a while, I'm still nervous. You know what I mean? Like, as an average dude just hanging out, chilling, he's cool, but he's just done so much, I get a little nerved up. So first off, he's originally from Oregon, but he lived in the Bay Area for nearly over 15 years and has just recently relocated to Jersey with his family. He has a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Theater from NYU, just a little bit of theater school. And, you've heard probably a little bit in the pre-show, but they did some unique dance moves, should we say that, sir? Some unique moves. We'll call it floor rolling, baby. Floor.
Yeah. A river of plastiques.
Oh, our guest has been playing with the interwebs for a long time. He's been building things, developer. He built his first website in 1995, so we're gonna have to talk about that. He's the founding partner of a digital agency called Chapter 3. They've worked with some big brands back in the day, United Nations, California Children's Hospital Association, so they're pretty big. Currently, he is the co-founder and chief strategy officer at Pantheon, which is a web hosting and web ops platform. They've raised over, roughly $200 million over the years. And some of their clients include Nestle. All of the Ivy League schools use their platform, UC Berkeley, Patch.com, and Clorox, just to name a few. Listeners and viewers, please give a warm welcome to Josh Koenig. Let's go! Josh, here we go! The crowd goes crazy! They love you, baby! They love you! Cash rules everything around me! Woo!
That's right.
Oh,
cash,
man.
Cash, indeed. Browser cache, CDN cache.
That's right.
All of that.
We know, hey, anytime AWS service goes out, man, I think about your shirt. The first time I met Josh Hampton, he was a keynote at a Drupal development conference. Shout out to the Drupal community. Shout out. And the shirt that he was wearing said cache, spelled C-A-C-H-E. Cache rules everything around me. Shout out to the great Wu-Tang Clan.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, this dude is cool as ish.
That shirt eventually disintegrated, but it was an all-timer. I think there's probably you go on to Etsy, and people have made that joke now a lot of times. But when I first discovered it, I was like, yes, this is how I want to show up,
Thank you, man. Thank you for being on the show, man. I can't believe, it's been that long, well over 10 or 12 years. So, yeah, I really appreciate you coming on the show, bro.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll jump right in with my question. I mean, so Josh, you've had an interesting background, right? We'll say that. Maybe a non-traditional background. What aha moment did you have that got you into computer programming?
I think like a lot of people in the industry who have been around for a little while, today you can go straight to school and be on a track to get your degree and go right into work for a big company, and they're going to have everything set up for you. It's all kind of figured out and systematized. But when I was first getting started, right, a lot of this stuff was very new. And so, I was lucky enough, was really privileged to be introduced to computers in general as a young kid, right? I had a Commodore VIC-20, which you could slot a little cartridge into and play Pong level games. And I kind of stuck with that. I was, again, my mom, who's a role model for me, she was an entrepreneur. She was a self-employed graphic designer. She had one of those old Mac, the little black and white screen all-in-one design, and she would produce stuff for folks around town. And so I had this kind of self-taught, hands-on interest in computers and technology that I was lucky enough to have be nurtured. And then when I got to high school, I had someone who was sort of a mentor to me, and I was getting along and starting to think about college. This was 1996 or so, and he was like, "You're almost completely self-taught on everything in technology. You're autodidact is what they call that." And I think if you went to school for computer science, you'd probably hate it, because they're just going to want to sit you down and teach you all this theory and do all this stuff. They're not going to get to actually do anything for quite a while. But here's my advice to you. I think you should go to college for whatever you're most passionate about. Follow that, what you're going to enjoy, and get a job. Because he knew I was going to need to work my way through college, right? And he said, if you can get a job in tech, you're smart enough to do that, wherever you can land, that will probably give you an education and a start in the field that you're more likely to succeed with than trying to get a Bachelor of Science in electrical engineering or something like that, which is what you kind of would have done. And in retrospect, that's really high-risk advice.
Right.
I went out and did auditions for theater school, and I got into NYU, Tisch School of the Arts. I was surprised that I got in. I didn't know if I was good enough. And then I was in New York City in 1997, 1998, and I was able to get a job with a completely ludicrous internet startup that was probably 30 years ahead of its time. I got an apprenticeship in how to build the internet. Like you said, you mentioned in the intro, that project was part of a digital high school yearbook thing. So I'd written some HTML before, and I knew how to
And you had a MySpace, which we all learned how to code from, of course.
No, totally. I mean, you could go off on that, right? That was so exciting.
Changing the color of the background. I was like, this is the stuff called HTML. It changes my background to black and orange. That's where I learned my first piece of code was MySpace. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, he did us all a solid. But I got a chance to essentially apprentice with some people that knew how to, here's how to run databases, here's how to build applications on the web. And I think, I worked my way through school doing that, and the startup never went anywhere. It never really got off the ground because it was just constantly chasing its tail, as a lot of stuff was in that kind of first dot-com bubble. But by the time I was done with school, the theater stuff that I got into, you alluded to, I tended, really veered more towards the artistic than the commercially viable. And I paid my rent exactly 2 times with acting, which I am proud of, 2 non-consecutive months.
Okay. What was the, are you allowed to say?
Wholesome stuff.
Okay, all right, cool.
I did a video, which was it was an educational video that was aimed at kids who were about to leave foster care. They were like going to be 18 and had to go out on their own. And so they producing this whole video series on like real basic life choices. And I was the guy who didn't believe in hygiene and was the cautionary tale and like got food poisoning because I wasn't like keeping my kitchen clean.
So you had to. So did they mess up your hair and?
Yeah. I like wore like really shabby clothes, and I was like, oh, it doesn't matter if it doesn't kill me, it'll make me stronger. And like my friends like, you should be wiping down your counters, and I was like, nah, that's just what It was good. But again, like a couple days work paid my rent, right? So, but I realized I was like, I wanted to keep living in New York, which is not cheap. So I was like, I'm gonna have to pay my rent on a monthly basis. So I started, just started freelancing basically and working my way up in the world of the web in 2000, 2001, 2002. And eventually, well, there's a whole story of how I got into Drupal and everything else, but that was kind of like how I got started in technology as a professional.
Yeah, no doubt. For some of our listeners and viewers, Drupal, shout out again. We're going to shout out a couple times. It's a content management system. I say our rivalry is WordPress. More people have heard of WordPress, but that's a whole nother story. So that's where I got a chance to meet Josh, because I used to dabble into webs a little bit myself. And you built a digital agency. So this is kind of like my question. So you built a digital agency, and then you kind of veered off the Pantheon. We'll talk about that in a second. But what was your first experience with remote work? So for me, when I talk about working remotely, and I tell people when we started in 2013, they're like, oh my gosh, you're so ahead of the time. And I was like, well, actually, I learned a lot about remote work from the Drupal community because so many organizations were already kind of leading in that realm. And I talk about meeting Matt Westgate and seeing Matt Westgate's talk at a DrupalCon in Denver in 2012 about how Lullabot had just gone, and they're another digital agency, how they had decided to go fully remote. And that was what spurred the idea of creating our consulting company. So what was your first experience with remote work, and how do you compare that to kind of like the experience today?
Man, that's a great question. The first experience with remote work was really in the kind of that freelancing context, but it's sort of not exactly the same because I was mostly working as a team of one. But you're freelancing, you're working from a home office. I had my whole computer desk set up in my bedroom, and that was like where, so some of the logistical joys and pains of remote work of like, oh, if I don't make myself, I won't leave the house today. That was something I was dealing with at the beginning of my career. But really getting involved in open source kind of made that come to life in terms of what's it like to work collaboratively with a lot of people in a remote context. And if I look back on the things that really worked then, and this is like 20 years ago, and the stuff that is commonplace now, I think what's changed is that some of the technology has gotten better packaged and easier for people to set up and use, but the stuff that we're doing is like, it's the same, right? Like Slack is just IRC, but with more usability, internet relay chat. Like it's the same core feature function, even the same core user interface.
I remember how difficult it was for me as a new user to log on to IRC. Like,
you have to go through this whole complicated dance.
It was very difficult. Yes. And that's how you would get help. And what he's referencing when he's talking about open source, just for some of our listeners and viewers who may not know, in a lot of open source communities, the software is generally free for everyone to use, but everyone else has to also help contribute code or whatever else back. It's community built. So what he was referencing earlier was in that space, you actually are working remotely because there's people all over the world contributing code.
Yeah. It's kind of a worldwide volunteer effort thing. And like, one of the things that I did, and people contribute in all sorts of ways, like you said. So people contribute code, which is great. Like I've got, I think 2 lines of code that has been contributed to Drupal core, which are both like minor things that I just put in. But I think that the thing that I did that was the most substantive contribution to the Drupal community was right after we started chapter 3, right, and I had been leaning on the community really hard and like getting the agency off the ground and like recruiting people and finding clients and then getting help to serve those clients, right? I was like, I got to give something back. And so I started doing an online training thing that we called the Drupal Dojo, and it actually really took off. And I look back on like what those early things were. Like, again, we were like installing software and setting things up and doing it. But like at the end of the day, the core experience was we had a video screen share.
Yes.
We had a Skype call going for audio, and we had IRC in another window, so there could be chat, audio, and video for me sharing screen. And I would just be like, here's how I code this stuff. And that's the core feature set of streaming.
Yes.
That is what Twitch and everything else makes possible. We just put it together with like chewing gum and duct tape in like 2006.
Wow. 2006.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
I don't know. It's interesting to me. Like some of these forums that we're in that like help us do this work and collaborate and participate remotely, they're established. Like they're kind of proven. I remember talking to people at the time when I was starting to set that up, and like these were like old internet heads. So like they were like, oh yeah. That reminds me a lot of the stuff we used to set up. We had like ARPANET relays and Usenet. And these guys were talking about doing like live internet stuff in the 80s. When the internet had like a few thousand people using it. They weren't doing video at the time because the cameras weren't easily accessible, but like the same kind of stuff was going on. I don't know. I think it's how people get together. It's how people collaborate. So I don't know. I'm glad we're getting better and better at it, and that stuff's getting easier to use, and practices are getting more well formed and well understood. But it's like we don't have to invent it. Like people already know how to do this.
Yeah, it seems like every decade or so there's like a wave of advancements and changes based on whatever the climate is. And when I say climate, it could be economic, what's going on in the world as far as geopolitical stuff like that, right? One of the biggest things that everybody on the planet had to go through was the pandemic, was COVID-19, right? Can you talk to us a little bit about how COVID-19 or the pandemic, how did that impact business at Pantheon?
Yeah, that was a really tumultuous time. Right. I think we were, in terms of just the way we worked, like going in January of 2020, Pantheon was just about 200 people, and 160 of them were based in the Bay Area. So we had people all over the world. We have Follow the Sun support. We have systems engineers intentionally hired across 3 continents. So there's like Follow the Sun 24/7 support. And you also like have salespeople that are remote, and you start to wanting to get good folks, good skilled technical people in these fields. A lot of them really, they're not going to move to San Francisco. They just prefer to work that way. So you start to develop a remote friendly policy. And I know some folks who are strong advocates for that would have said, yeah, it was trying to be remote friendly. It was maybe more remote tolerant because there's cases where it's like. It's no fun to be the one person on video when everybody else is in a room, right? That's not a great experience, even under the most ideal AV circumstances and everything else. But then we had to switch to being fully remote all the time, pretty much overnight.
Really?
Yeah, because the city of San Francisco, said offices are all closed, figure it out. And people did. Like, we had the tools. We had Slack. We had Zoom. We had all the things. Like, those were already in the company.
But you and your co-founders being developers and having that experience yourself, did it make it easier for you all, or was it just as hard?
I think it was easier for us as individuals. I don't know how much it helped the company because there was just a lot of people who did not have any experience. And because we had the office, and that was a real big part of how we developed the company and nurtured the culture and the teams, that was something that everybody did rely on. Even though we had personal experience of how to be productive working remotely, we hadn't built the company remotely. And so it was a big shift. And like there was a whole thing of a thread in the Slack of like people just, in those first few weeks putting in like photos of like their completely improvised work from home setups. Yeah, right. Trying to get something that's like remotely ergonomic with it all set up. And then on the other end, from a business standpoint, it was also really disruptive because a lot of our customers are like they're institutions. They're like large scale. Like we have a lot of smaller business customers and direct customers, but most of those are actually served through our digital agencies. We don't work too much with them directly. A lot of our business is with these bigger, more institutional scale customers, and they all put a pause on everything because they were going through the same thing. And so we basically had to rethink the business in a world where there might be like no new customers for like months because people were just not prioritizing web projects when they were trying to figure out how to work internally in this new environment. And we really focused on like, let's be efficient. We know that this is going to disrupt the business. We know that it's probably going to come back in a big way because the demand isn't evaporating. It's just that people are putting all these projects on hold while they figure out how to manage the disruption on their side. And so that was an interesting exercise. I think that we actually learned a lot from all of that.
What were some of the real big challenges that you were faced with as an organization once you had to kind of go fully remote? Like, what were some of the big ones right off the bat? Besides the office setup, you already talked about the difficulty for that, but like, you know.
I think good remote operations, you know, you need a really strong culture of documentation and writing things down. And we had a culture that it wasn't weak on that, but I wouldn't have called it strong either. And we had a culture that was over-reliant on meetings, I would say. Yeah. And that pattern doesn't scale very well when you're thinking about remote work. And then the other thing where that really started to show was some teams had managers that understood or were able to quickly learn on like how to do collaboration, how to like get people coordinated and trust them to do their work, and some teams didn't. And that started to show a little bit. And then what really I think was the biggest challenge was, you know, sort of going into 2021, business picked up in a big way. We started to really grow again.
Oh yeah. Okay.
We started to hire and onboarding people into a remote situation. Again, some teams had already existing structure and they were very good at it. Other teams weren't. And so we started to see just people who would hire and then not last very long. We started to see issues with just like overall team sort of feeling like we were maybe losing some of the culture and some of the values. Like we don't have a culture. Pantheon's big enough that where it's like it's not a monoculture. There's like lots of subcultures within the company. Yeah. But we try to have consistent values and like try to all have a vibe that informs how we operate. And like the office had been a big part of how that sort of happened. And we hadn't intentionally put in place something that could replicate or supplement for the lack of that. And I think we started to feel that too, where, you know, sometimes it was just like operationally people would get hired and they wouldn't be given the tools to succeed, or they wouldn't onboard, like it just would kind of a failure to launch. But then even when people did onboard successfully and they could do their work, we were just like, people didn't know each other right there. And when you don't know the people you work with, you know, one of the values we want to have as a company is passion and like having people put their heart into their work, because like you want to do great work, you got to put your heart into it. But if you're working with a bunch of strangers, that's not an environment where you want to, for most people, it's not going to bring that level of engagement. So we've had to like really work on that.
You know, in my line of business, I talk with a lot of our customers, and it sounds very similar to you. Training, retaining your people. It's the process, right? Processes changed because they had to, and technology and things can kind of help with that. But sometimes it's just, hey, we got to look at this differently. So our processes need to change, maybe bring in some automation and things in there at different places. And then it's the connection and the culture. How do you build a culture to support people and make people feel like they can be their authentic selves, they can be passionate, but still be remote and feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves, right? Like, because it stinks to be working and like in your little silo and feel disconnected, even though your work might still be part of the bigger picture of the success of the company. It's the human connection, right? That's how we're created, right? We're social beings. So it's very interesting to hear the consistency and the commonality that I've heard with some of, you know, different customers I've talked to in my line of work. But it's like we're all going through this together, right? And now we're coming out on the other end, which is very interesting. And just to allude to the beginning of the question of like, how did the pandemic affect you? What are you now seeing as like, okay, the pandemic's over. What did we learn that can remain? And what things did we get back to that we were doing well before the pandemic kind of took us off track, so to speak?
I think a lot of tech companies went through a lot of growth in 2021. 2022, you know, I mentioned like at the beginning, it was like 2/3 of the company was based in the Bay Area. You know, the beginning of this year, the company's more than twice the size it was. And I think there's like 80 people based in the Bay Area.
So you're saying now you have roughly 400 employees?
Yeah, it's over 400 employees now.
Oh my gosh. And only 80 are in the Bay Area now?
Yeah, and the office has space for 150. So and 80 in the Bay Area is, you know, that includes the wider Bay Area. So people who like live an hour commute away, they're not coming into the office every day.
No,
right.
No.
Right.
No.
And people who live within walking distance are, because that's a great perk, right? Like you don't have to have a work from home setup because you can just walk down the block and there's a nice office with dedicated space and it's quiet, right? Who wouldn't make the most of that situation? So what we're thinking through is and like, look, I myself, I'm in New Jersey now, right? I'm not in the Bay Area, but we have there's still a core of leadership that's in San Francisco, and it does help teams getting together, especially with some of the connectedness, but also with certain types of work. Like we're building organizational capacity around when and how to do an offsite and have it be really effective.
Okay.
So that you can do something that helps, with team getting to know and building those human connections, but also getting through like group processing of problems and decision making is something that getting together in person can really accelerate.
Yes.
For people who are really experienced with it, like you can do all these things remotely, and having had those experiences in open source and so forth, like that all happens. But even in really good remote setups, I still think it kind of might sometimes happens more slowly, right? The whole thing of like get people into a room and figure it out is a real thing, and you can get people onto a Zoom and try the same thing, and it's tough. Right, you might not be able to get, it's not as high bandwidth. You don't have body language. You can't just sit there and whiteboard, right? You can't work face to face. And especially if you're trying to come to a consensus where there is some disagreement or there's a lot of unknowns or there's a lot of risks, it's like a challenging decision-making process. Face to face is really good. So I'd say give us like a B+ on how good we are at just being kind of a remote forward company, but we're improving, and there's still a lot more room for improvement. Is when and how do you organize and structure things where because it's expensive to get people together, right?
Yeah.
It's expensive to travel, and it's hard on people's home lives because they're essentially away from their families, right? So you can't do this all the time, but if you can do it right, you can get some breakthroughs, I think.
One more question before Hampton asks the famous question. I know we're coming up on time here. So you kind of alluded to it a little bit right there as far as some things that you think your company needs to work on as far as building connection and coming up with a purpose. Instead of kind of predicting what do you think the future of work will be like, we've done that so many times. We're at episode like 50. I don't even know where we're at, but we're over 50, and we've asked that question in a different way a million times. I like to ask something different. So what are some of the questions that you think companies will have to answer when it comes to how we work moving forward? Like you've already talked about the big one for you is identifying how and when to get together. But what are some other like big questions that these companies need to have answers from moving forward?
So I think a really big one is going to be, where do the investments go that would have historically gone towards like a physical capital project like an office? I'm thinking like even bigger companies. Now I'm on the East Coast now, so I meet more and more people in my community who work in finance, and like those guys are back. They are 5 days a week in office, or you are out the door, and they're checking badge scans. And one of the reasons for that is their management is like wants to go back to the old ways, and that's their prerogative. But there's an incentive there because a lot of those big firms, like they own their buildings, and so that's like we have this asset and we have to use it, right? And I think that increasingly there are going to be companies that will have a need to make decisions about where they invest in the workplace. What is the workplace, and where and how do we invest in it? Because I do think like the assumption that you could just give people a little stipend to set up their home office and like that'll get it done, I don't think that's going to scale very well. One of the things that really also struck me at Pantheon during the pandemic, but this just puts a fine point on it, is the people that this was the hardest on, especially initially, were all of our entry-level employees. Because they don't have a home office. They have roommates.
Yes.
Right?
Roommates.
And it's like
and they want to meet people.
And they want to meet people. And they're trying to learn, right? But in a world where if you're not going back to like mandating 5 days in office, right? I think that splits the difference, and I don't know that it really helps.
Yeah.
It doesn't give you flexibility in terms of geography and location for developing talent. And it also kind of like doesn't really give you all the benefit, because then you end up going to an office to be on a Zoom, right?
Yes.
That's no good. So I think, the question of how and where do you invest in what type of workplace facilities and how much of that is centralized and how much of that is distributed. I think we'll see some interesting things where people are looking at, hubs as a strategy and not as like a necessarily a traditional office with like cubicles, but like we're going to invest in a facility that's really just about teams getting together, and it's going to get used on we're going to schedule and coordinate stuff and make use of this facility for that. I've already seen some of this where people have just taken advantage of the time to just like really rethink their floor plans and so forth, and so they're like repurposing the actual places where they have to help people do work. So it's already happening, but I think that's going to be a really big question.
That's a big one. Jeez, when you say reinvest, I love the way you framed it of where are they going to reinvest in what the workplace is.
Yeah.
Because, and I love hearing the word workplace because it gets us away from that word office, and it gets us away from work from home as well. That's a big answer that you're going to have to figure out as a company, especially if you own a bunch of buildings.
Yeah. I mean, in San Francisco, I go back there 4 or 5 times a year at least, right, to do meetings and work with a team. But like, Salesforce just finished building the tallest building in San Francisco in 2019.
Oh my gosh.
And it is empty right now.
I thought they were supposed to be back in the office.
Well, the other thing is, like, these are publicly shared companies, right? So how do they justify that to their shareholders of like, hey, we just made this huge investment in this building, but we're remote, so we don't need it.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting because again, I'm not a financial professional, but my guess is there's going to be a wave of scrambling as they're mandated to reevaluate how much that asset is worth, because it's probably sitting on their books with whatever it was worth circa 2019 when they built it, which was
it's not worth that anymore,
and it's doesn't have the same value anymore. And at some point they'll be forced to recognize that, and then there will be a bunch of interesting conversations. Wow. I'm sure there are interesting conversations now happening ahead of that, but
yeah, jeez. All right, sir, it's your show, Sir Hampton.
So yeah, I mean, this is the best part. I think I have the best question, which is the best. So we talk some good business stuff, but our listeners don't want to hear about all that all the time. They want to get to know really something good and funny, or maybe entertaining about your experience. So can you tell us about a comical or even inspiring moment that you've had while working remotely?
Yeah, I'm going to go with comical. This was recent. It just happened, and it got a chuckle out of me. So as I said, moved to Jersey just recently, and I have my office right now is this old, it used to be a porch, and then the previous owners blasted in and made it year-round. So it's like cool for me. It's got lots of natural light, but it also means like I'm kind of in a fishbowl, like I'm still gonna feel for what like living in suburbia is all about. And so so we were at a block party last week, and we were meeting some more of our neighbors, like from the next block over, so people we didn't know quite as well. And one of the moms was like, yeah, it's nice to meet you. My sons are convinced that you're a DJ. Because they go by, right? They can see in my windows, and they see me at it, standing up at this desk. I've always got these big headphones on. And I said, listen, let's not shatter that illusion. I want to lean into that. That's right. Yep, yes. I'm doing a set right now for Belarus.
Belarus. So they think you're a famous DJ. What are you going to say when they ask you, can they get tickets to your show, bro?
I don't know. I'll have to see how long I can keep this illusion alive, but I thought it was funny.
That is great, man. That is great. Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us, sir. I really appreciate that. What a fascinating question for all you entrepreneurs and business owners out there. If you need to host a website, make sure you check out Pantheon. It's a dope platform. Josh, where can our listeners and viewers find you on the interwebs?
Oh, that's a good. So professionally, Pantheon, Pantheon.io. There's everything you ever want to know is there. And then on the internet, my internet handle has been since those early days, Outlandish Josh. So that's my Twitter handle. I've got a blog that I very rarely update now. That's there with more than you would ever want to know about me and my travels. But yeah, and you can just search my name on LinkedIn if you want to see what I'm posting professionally these days.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much for coming by. Hampton, thank you for being a guest host. You got to meet my brother, Josh. I mean,
that's awesome. It was great to meet you, Hampton. Always fun. The Clarkson brothers are a dynamic duo.
Josh, it's great to meet you, and it's always fun working with you, son. I love you.
Cool. Love you too, man. All right, fellas. I'll talk to you later. Peace.
All right.
Have a good one.
You've been listening to Remotely One. Visit us at remotely1.com/podcast for upcoming episodes. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and download our episodes on your favorite podcast app.
Hey, don't forget to clock out.